For 3 days, 82-year-old Denis Wilson sat motionless at Chicago O'Hare's Gate 37, eyes fixed on the arrivals board. Airport staff grew increasingly concerned as he remained in the same position, barely moving except for occasional restroom breaks. When security finally approached the disheveled man on the third day, his response made the veteran officer call for immediate backup. The bustling Chicago O'Hare Airport never seemed to sleep. A constant flow of travelers rushed through its terminals, racing to catch flights or eagerly awaiting loved ones. Among the sea of hurried faces sat 82-year-old Denis Wilson, a stark contrast to the chaotic energy surrounding him. Denis sat perfectly still in a neatly pressed suit, his small overnight bag beside him. His eyes remained fixed on the arrivals board, occasionally glancing down at his wristwatch before returning his gaze to the constantly updating flight information. He seemed unbothered by the noise and commotion, a picture of patience in a place designed for temporary stays. Maria, an airport custodian who had worked at O'Hare for over a decade, first noticed Denis on Friday morning during her regular shift. As she mopped the floor near Gate 37, something about the elderly man caught her attention. Unlike most passengers who came and went within hours, there was something in his demeanor that suggested he wasn't going anywhere soon. With a kind smile, Maria approached Denis and offered him a cup of water, which he accepted with grateful eyes and a gentle nod. When she asked if he needed any assistance, Denis simply told her he was waiting for his flight, his voice steady and certain. Maria continued her rounds, and when her shift ended 8 hours later, she noticed Denis hadn't moved from his spot. By Saturday afternoon, Denis had become something of a fixture at Gate 37. Several airport employees had taken note of the elderly gentleman who remained in virtually the same position as the day before. The only evidence that he moved at all was his occasional visits to the nearby restroom or purchases from the terminal kiosk. Mary, who worked at the information desk just across from Gate 37, leaned over to her colleague and pointed discreetly toward Denis. The situation had begun to raise concerns among the staff. It wasn't uncommon for passengers to experience delays, but an elderly man waiting alone for this long was unusual. Security Officer James decided it was time to check on the situation. With a friendly but professional demeanor, he approached Denis late Saturday evening. James introduced himself and asked if everything was all right. Denis looked up with clear blue eyes that seemed slightly confused by the question. He insisted everything was fine and that he was simply waiting for an important arrival. When James requested to see Denis's ID and travel documents, the elderly man produced them without hesitation. Everything appeared to be in order, though Denis seemed somewhat confused when asked about his specific travel plans. Not wanting to disturb a passenger who seemed otherwise well, James made a mental note to check on Denis again later and continued his patrol. By Sunday morning, the situation had notably deteriorated. Denis's once neatly combed silver hair now stood in disheveled tufts. His eyes were bloodshot, suggesting he'd barely slept. The crisp suit that had looked so immaculate on Friday was wrinkled, and Denis himself appeared increasingly disoriented. James approached Denis again, this time with more concern in his voice. He gently pointed out that Denis had been at the airport for 3 days now. He asked if there was perhaps someone he could call for him, family, friends, anyone who might be expecting him. Denis looked momentarily confused before his expression cleared. He explained there was no need for concern. He was waiting for Margaret's flight from Paris, Flight 847. She had been visiting their daughter Claire in France and would be landing soon. Denis's face softened as he mentioned that Margaret always brought him French chocolates when she visited their daughter. The security officer stepped away to check the flight schedules on his tablet. After a thorough search, he confirmed what he had suspected. There was no Flight 847 from Paris scheduled for that day or week. The situation now required additional assistance. James contacted Diane, the senior security supervisor on duty. Diane sat beside Denis, introduced herself, and began a conversation about his wife, Margaret. Immediately, Denis's face lit up with affection. He explained they had been married for 54 wonderful years. Diane carefully asked Denny if he had any other family members they could contact while waiting for Margaret's flight. Perhaps his son or daughter might want to know he was at the airport. At this question, Denis's brow furrowed. He began searching for Michael's number, mumbling that he should have it somewhere. As he fumbled with his wallet, A worn card fell out onto the floor. Diane picked it up and discovered it was an emergency contact card with Michael Wilson's name and phone number. While Denis continued watching the arrivals board, Diane stepped away to make the call. When Michael answered, the relief in his voice was immediate and overwhelming. They had been searching everywhere for his father since Friday. As the conversation continued, the heart-wrenching truth began to unfold. Michael explained in a hushed, emotional voice that his mother, Margaret Wilson, had died 7 months earlier in a tragic car accident in Paris. She had been visiting their sister Claire and was on her way back to the airport to return home to Denis when the accident occurred. Michael's voice cracked as he explained how his father's dementia had worsened dramatically after his mother's death. Denis kept reliving the day Margaret was supposed to return, often becoming agitated and insistent about needing to pick her up from the airport. Before ending the call, Michael urgently requested that no one tell his father about Margaret's death. The last time they had tried to correct his reality, Denis had experienced the grief all over again, as fresh and devastating as the first time. Michael explained he would drive to the airport immediately, though it would take about 3 hours to arrive. Diane returned to Denis, who immediately asked for an update on Flight 847. He seemed increasingly anxious, worrying that Margaret must be concerned about whether he had remembered to pick her up. Instead of contradicting his reality, Diane sat with Denis and engaged him in conversation about his life with Margaret. While they talked, Diane discreetly arranged for medical support. When the airport paramedics arrived, they found Denis was significantly dehydrated and exhausted from his 3-day vigil. They provided him with fluids and monitored his vitals while continuing to honor his perception of why he was there. 3 hours later, Michael Wilson rushed through the terminal, his worried eyes scanning the seating area until he spotted his father still waiting patiently at gate 37. Denis looked up and noticed his son approaching. A smile spread across his face as he greeted Michael. He seemed surprised, commenting that Michael was early and explaining that they were still waiting for his mother's flight. With practiced gentleness, Michael sat beside his father and took his hand. He explained that there had been a change of plans. Mom's flight had been rerouted, and she had called to ask Michael to bring Denis home. She would meet them there instead. Denis nodded in acceptance. He commented that Margaret always thought of everything, didn't she? Always so organized and considerate. As Michael helped his father gather his overnight bag and stand up, the airport staff who had been involved exchanged somber glances, the weight of the situation settling over them. The elderly man who had waited faithfully for 3 days walked out of the terminal, leaning on his son's arm, still looking forward to a reunion that could only exist in his mind. The airport returned to its normal rhythm of arrivals and departures, but the staff at Gate 37 would not soon forget the elderly man in the gray suit whose love and devotion transcended even the boundaries of memory and reality. And you, how far would you go to protect a loved one from heartbreak, even if it meant living in their version of reality?